Hey, discerning listeners, a lot of you have been asking me to watch this Netflix documentary, Stutz, by Jonah Hill. I think he talks with his therapist, and there's a lot of people. I don't think I've ever had so many requests to watch something, so let's watch and see what happens.
Okay, entertain me.
That's actually what you say when I sit down.
Yeah, it's what I say to everybody.
Yeah, when we have a therapy session that's not filmed for a movie.
Okay, so it looks like it is Jonah Hill's actual therapist. He starts off the session by saying, entertain me. There's a lot of thinking in my field, a lot of debate, and a lot of personal hand-wringing. As a therapist, all of us will worry about what do we say at the beginning of every session? Because, it can set the tone. You could hurt someone's feelings. How do you set the stage? How do you express interest? But the thing is by the time you're my age, you've had thousands and thousands of sessions. So you can't start every session with something different. You kind of have to have a routine, but you also don't want to have it come across like you're just mailing it in, like you're just, going through the motions, right? So you want to have emphasis to it. So I think that's more of the concern for novice therapists out there. I would say that there are things that you obviously don't want to say at the beginning of session, like, tell me how screwed up you are today or something. But I don't know, some therapists could pull that off if they're joking and they have a client that likes that kind of a joke. So, there's really no rules to therapy like that. But anyway, the key, though, is to somehow express to the client that you're open, that you want to know how they're doing. It really also depends on the style of therapy that you do, right? If you're a pretty strict CBT therapist, you might actually say, all right, let's go over your homework. That might be the first thing that you say. Or if you're an IFS therapist, you might say something like, all right, who's presenting right now? Who's the forefront in terms of your inner system? So, I don't know. But what I say is, I think I just say things like, how are things going? And I'm guessing it's changed over my 25 years. But I've never said that, entertain me, at least to my knowledge. And I'm wondering where he gets that from, if he says that to everyone or he only says it to Jonah Hill. I don't know. But the main key is to express that you're open, you're interested. Therapy was taught to me as a sacred space, meaning that the room, the vibe, the confidentiality, the freedom for the client to be themselves is a very unique place. It's akin to stepping into a synagogue or a church or a mosque or something, or a memorial. You step into that space and you just feel the energy. It's not an actual energy, but it's an association that we have with it. We understand that this is a different place. I'm not at the mall or I'm not at work. I'm in a different place. And as a therapist, a lot of that sacred space depends on how you set it up. And so the vibe of the office, the first thing that you say, your demeanor, your energy, making sure that you're not frantically running into session and then you sit down, okay, how you doing? That's why therapists need to always be early for their sessions so they can center and get into the mood and create a space that's open and calm.
The other thing you say that always cracks me up, which is great, is you better not come in here and dump all your shit on me.
No, you've been dumping it on me for years. I'm tired.
All right, so at first I thought Stutz might be joking about that, don't dump all your shit on me. But it sounds like it's semi-joking, but also somewhat honest. Right off the bat, I'm getting a vibe of honesty from this therapist. This isn't necessarily my style. I mean, it is, I'm in that direction, but I know therapists that are this style where they're just extremely honest, brutally honest at times. And the benefit to that is that as a client, you can trust what is going on in the therapist's mind because they're honest with you. You can trust them. It feels safer. You can feel closer to that person. It might give you license as a client yourself to express displeasure with your therapist because he's doing that with you. But you run a risk, obviously, of alienating some clients, saying like, don't dump all your shit on me, right? But like I said, there's no rules about this. It's what works. It's what helps. And I don't know, but I suspect Jonah Hill is highlighting this psychiatrist because Jonah Hill has found it helpful. Also, novice therapists out there, in my experience, they get real worried about stepping out of line and being called unethical or being called out or being found out as an imposter. And so there's all these rules that novice therapists will impose on themselves. But more experienced therapists, which I'm guessing he is, and myself, we understand that there's a lot of variability. There's a lot of freedom. There's a lot of license to do things that you might not do otherwise, or do things that from the outside might sound a little strange, but might actually really be helpful. So, let's continue watching.
Well, here we are. Why do you think I'm making this movie about you?
I think it's my ideas. I think my ideas had an effect on you, and I think you want to expose other people to the ideas. And maybe, I don't know, maybe it's just the attempt to gain control over me, or...
Yeah, I mean, so that, I don't know if he's a psychodynamic-oriented therapist or what, but that is an hypothesis and something that would be smart to think and also to maybe throw out there. So I think what he's saying is, I think why you want to do this documentary is, one, you want to get my ideas out there, but maybe you actually want to get some control over me, because it's Jonah Hill's world, right? Media and documentaries and cameras and directors and cinematographers and editors. That's all Jonah Hill's world. And as a client, he might feel powerless or underneath the therapist. And there's a lot to be said about that topic, by the way. I'm going to try not to yammer too much, because what I just touched upon, the power dynamic in a relationship, I could lecture for 10, 20 hours about that. It's an extremely complicated thing, and there's a lot of different styles that can work, a lot of different considerations, there's a big history that goes back 150 years in our field that has a lot of ups and downs regarding recognizing that power and that privilege, and their whole movements within psychotherapy over the past 70 years that have been counter to this or that. And so it's a complicated thing. So I don't want to get bogged down in that, but it is a good conceptualization that for the therapist to at least think, like, I wonder if Jonah Hill, my client, is actually trying to act out some sort of power play on me. Doesn't mean it's bad, right? Actually, a lot of therapists, including myself, will invite that. Some clients will, they'll point out something in my office. They'll be like, they'll have expertise about chairs or something. And they'll say, like, that chair, you could do this. And there's a temptation as a therapist to be like, wait, I'm in charge here. You don't advise me. But, there might be a reason for that. And looking at that clinically as to why that's happening. Maybe it's a good thing. Maybe it's an indication that the client is feeling comfortable or wants to level the playing field a little bit, which is absolutely okay, obviously. Or it could be a passive aggression because they feel overpowered. They have transference around powerlessness from their childhood, and so they're acting out in the way. It's just a lot of different possibilities, but, the therapist throws that out there.
I don't know, maybe it's just the attempt to gain control over me, or... I'm not sure. Why did you?
Yeah, I've decided to make this because I want to present your tools and the teachings of you, Phil Stutz.
And I will say, I commend Jonah Hill for doing this, because he has a loud megaphone. He has a huge audience. It's a wonderful trend. I mean, for decades, people in my field, and before I came along, have been trying to promote the normalcy of therapy, the non-stigmatization of therapy, and Jonah Hill is helping with that. And in the past, even just 5 years, maybe particularly during the pandemic even, the amount of destigmatization around therapy has just accelerated, which I have to say is a little mind-blowing. I sometimes forget that a lot of people now accept that therapy is a normal thing. I mean, when I first came into the field in the 90s, I would tell relatives that I was a therapist, and I would get very strange reactions from people, scared reactions, or judgmental reactions. Oh, therapy's a bunch of crap or whatever. I mean, you're still going to get that, of course, but I feel like it's much less now, particularly in certain cultural pockets, of course.
Let's get a new patient.
The first thing you ask them is, what do you want? Why are you here? The average shrink will say, don't intrude on the patient's process. They will come up with the answers when they're ready. That sucks. That's not acceptable. When I got into psychiatry, the motto was I'm neutral. I'm just watching. I have no dog in this fight.
Right. So there are different schools, of course, different schools of thought, different philosophies, different models of therapy in my field. And although I suspect he's older than me, I don't think he's that much older. So I have a bit of an awareness of what preceded me and possibly where he came from in terms of his training. But he is describing, I think, as a psychoanalytic approach, which was pretty dominant, psychodynamic, more generally approach, pretty dominant, I think, particularly in psychiatry, particularly in certain areas of the country and the world, for that matter. There are other areas, of course. You got systems theory, family systems theory. You have brief therapies, collaborative therapy, solution-focused narrative. You have feminist therapies and multicultural therapies. You have humanistic therapies, emotion-focused, existential, those kinds of things. What am I leaving out? You have, of course, cognitive theories, cognitive therapies. You have behavioral therapies. What am I leaving out? You have neurobiological theories. Anyway, so I'm guessing he came from a psychoanalytic school of thought. That's what he was trained in. And so he's saying that he was told that he should be a blank slate. And there's a lot of helpfulness to that. And if you're into that sort of thing as a therapist and as a client, there's pros and cons to it. I think my very first therapist was like that, and it was good in the beginning, but it really annoyed me as time went on. In the beginning, I liked it because it just provided this very non-judgmental space where I just explored and I just free associated, as they say. And then at a certain point, though, maybe I was 19, and about 5-10 sessions in, I was yammering, and at some point I just turned to him and I was just like, so what do you think about all this stuff? Like I've been, because I thought I was telling him, I thought he wanted more data. And so I'm telling him all this stuff thinking, well, eventually once he has enough data, he'll tell me what's wrong with me or so. I don't know. I'm 19. I don't really know. And so I, at some point, turned to him and said, what do you think about this? And he said, well, what do you want me to think about it? Those kinds of psychoanalytic questions. And there are various different ways to deal with it, of course. But it bothered me because I'm like, wait, so I'm just yammering? Like, that's nice. It's nice that you're listening. It's nice. But I'd just like some feedback or some kind of thing to bump up against. Now, you can be a blank slate as a psychoanalyst or a psychodynamic, sort of classic psychodynamic therapist and still provide some sort of feedback or some kind of contact with a client. You don't passively just listen all the time. You can more get involved. It's complicated, but it sounds like that's where he came from, and he doesn't like that. Now, I will say that the psychoanalytic, psychodynamic approach is the minority at this point. There are very few therapists. In fact, I don't think I know anyone. I know that I know of them in Seattle, but I would give it like 0.5% of therapists in Seattle operate from this classic psychoanalytic, maybe even less than that, honestly. But in the past, again, it was more prevalent, and maybe particularly in psychiatry. So he's saying that he wants to be more active.
Usually the first question you ask a new patient.
The first thing you ask them is, what do you want? Why are you here? The average shrink will say, don't intrude on the patient's process. They will come up with the answers when they're ready. That sucks. That's not acceptable.
Right. So what he's referring to, and I completely agree, and I would say most therapists do as well, and it's an underemphasized thing in training and in supervision. And you'll hear me ranting about this when I watch therapy sessions on reality TV, which is the question, why are you here? What do you want from me? What do you want from therapy? And there are various different reasons as to why therapists don't ask this question. One is because they might be so psychoanalytically trained and so classic in that way that's, as he's putting it, it's like imposing on the process. You're interfering with the free associative process such that it will insert your own agenda into their system. And so you want to be this blank slate, a complete blank canvas. It's, I guess a metaphor would be that you're trying to help someone to feel good about themselves as they create art. And so you're a teacher and you have a student and they're coming up to the palette and to the canvas and you're just like, hey, do whatever you want. There's the paint. There are the brushes, here's the canvas, and you just step back. And that's the first step. You just want them to play with it a little bit, right? And maybe what happens is the student stands there and says, but I don't know what to do. And then maybe your style as a teacher is to say, well, I don't know what to tell you, and you're hoping as a teacher, think like Mr. Miyagi kind of did some of this stuff with Daniel, of like the teaching is in this moment. The fact that you don't know what to do, there's something inside of you that you have to wrestle with. And I'm not going to save you from that. And I'm not going to insert what I think is there, because if I propose something, if I suggest what you're going through right now, you might latch onto that. It might deny you the exploration process, right? So what a lot of people will do today, though, is they will ask very explicitly, what do you want out of therapy? And another reason why, a bigger reason as to why therapists don't ask this question, and there are two of them. One is they're not trained well enough to do that, and they don't know they're supposed to ask that question, maybe even literally every session, but particularly in the beginning of therapy, the first 5-10 sessions, you just want to check in with that sort of thing. But anyway, the other reason is that therapists might be afraid of even asking the question because they're afraid of the answer. There's a lot of things in therapy that are like that, where therapists don't ask certain questions or don't go to certain areas because they're afraid of the answer. That feedback is another thing that therapists, according to research, just asking for feedback from a client about the session or about the therapy improves outcomes. Even if you don't even do anything about the feedback, just asking the question improves outcomes for a variety of speculative reasons. But anyway, so therapists are afraid to ask the question, what do you want out of today's session? Because there's this paranoia that the therapist has that if the client doesn't like the therapy, it might highlight that. So you ask a client, what do you want to do today? And the client says like, well, I don't really think there's anything you can help me with because I don't really think you're a good therapist. I'm not even joking. Most therapists, if not all, have at least some of that paranoia. Therapy is hard. It's very complicated. There's no strict guideline. There are certain occupations that have a pretty clear guideline as to what you're supposed to do. If you stay in this lane, you'll probably be okay. Therapy is far from that. In fact, the more you try to limit yourself into a lane, the worse therapist you often become. It's a lot about wisdom and reading the situation, having tons of experience, knowing yourself, understanding emotions, understanding human experience, being able to truly listen and listen to yourself and know your bias and understand your culture. And it's eternally complex. There's no way to achieve anything close to even 50% competency in this field. You're always going to be mostly incompetent because of the sheer volume of information or experience that you're supposed to attain. So what he's saying is, I always ask the question, what do you want out of today's session? Which you often hear me ranting about, which I just did again.
In this fight, it was a very slow process, and there was a lot of suffering. And you know me, my action would be, well, then go fuck yourself. Are you kidding me? If I'm dealing with someone with depression like that who's afraid they won't recover, I say, do what the fuck I tell you. Do exactly what I tell you. I guarantee you'll feel better. Guarantee 100% it's on me.
Wait, so lots to say. One, obviously swearing, saying fuck and shit and damn and all those kinds of things is obviously fine. People can swear how they want to swear. And there's, I think, a myth out there somehow that therapists are all wholesome, buttoned up individuals. Believe me, we're not. So we're human beings. Now, will all therapists swear? Not necessarily, but, inside or outside therapy, maybe not, maybe. But it's all a matter of communication. Sometimes you'll hear me in these videos, I'll swear. And I think I'm using it to emphasize, it means something. These swear words have meaning. They're not just throwaway words. They have a specific connotation, a specific purpose to using them, right? Now, think of other people that just use it haphazardly, right? Like Andre or something, when he's upset, he inserts it every other word, and I think it starts to lose its meaning and makes it harder to understand him, but, each to their own. But anyway, so he's swearing. Obviously, that's fine. And a lot of times in my past, when I used to work more with teenagers and families, this is in the first 10 years of my career, about a third of my clients were teenagers and their families. And I would sometimes swear on purpose in front of the kids, not like artificially, but I would speak more freely, which would involve more swear words, because I wanted the teenager to see me not as an adult. I mean, not as an adult, but not as an authority, because I wasn't. A lot of times the teenage clients would see me as a teacher or a parent or a police officer or something, and I'm far from that. I mean, they could tell me anything and I would not tell their parents, that kind of thing, depending on the confidentiality arrangement. But so there's that. Two, I would never tell a teenager that they're wrong or that they need to do this or that. I'm a therapist. I'm here to help people with their emotions and their process and to feel validated and to explore things. And I'm not here to tell people what to do. And just saying that to a client doesn't necessarily sink in. If I start swearing or I start acting not like an authority, counter to what they often see from authority figures, then maybe they'll feel like, oh, maybe this is really different. But anyway, the other thing that he's saying, at first I was going along with, because there's this idea that you're never supposed to give advice. You'll hear this in training programs, which is absurd. Now, if you as a therapist want to have a style in which you, quote unquote, never give advice, solution-focused therapists come to mind, collaborative therapists come to mind, brief therapists, narrative therapists typically don't provide any sort of advice, at least directly. And fine, there are styles of therapy that absolutely are demonstrated to work along those lines. But, the vast majority of therapy involves at least some subtle advice. Now, what I wish they did in the training programs, and maybe they do more often than I'm seeing, but I wish they said, you don't want to jump to advice. Like a client comes in and says, I'm depressed. I don't know what to do. I don't have motivation. It's really common for people, whether they're therapists or not, to have an impulse to just be like, well, have you tried this? Have you tried scented candles? Have you tried getting more sleep? But when you do that, it denies the client an opportunity to talk about what they're going through, and also comes across like you're kind of mansplaining, or you're splaining to the client things that they probably already know. It's like, oh, no shit, Sherlock, getting good sleep actually helps your life. Wow, thank you. I'm glad I'm paying for this, And a lot of times, depression and other kinds of things can be solely alleviated just by listening to someone and not giving advice, because they never get that. When they talk to people in the real world, everyone is constantly giving advice. So on one hand, you want to be really careful about advice, but on the other hand, there are times when advice or advice-like statements are very helpful. Like if I have a couple who are fighting and misunderstanding each other, I might, after lots of exploration and listening and asking them how the conflict went, I might at some point say that I might suggest to them that the next time they get in a fight like this, that they take a beat, take a breath, and think about how they might be misinterpreting their partner, or raise the question, am I misinterpreting my partner? Am I assuming things about their demeanor that we've learned over time, over many sessions, aren't necessarily true, if not ever true, right? So that's advice. I'm telling a client, maybe you should do this, right? And it helps for me to do that. It helps for me to highlight that. Now, you could argue that it's obvious in the discussion, but sometimes it's not, right? And some clients really want that. They really, so we've been talking about a lot of things. What am I supposed to do this week? And so, okay, well, how about you try this and this and this? Now, it's important that therapists don't just fall in love with their own advice. It's a very complicated thing, okay? So what he's highlighting is, in the psychoanalytic community to some extent, but also just generally in the therapy field, there's often this rule that as a therapist, you're never supposed to give advice. And what he's saying is like, that's all bullshit. And I was just like, yeah, absolutely. It's too simplistic, right? But then he says, I know 100% right what will solve your depression. Which I don't know if he's joking. I hope he's joking, but that is not possible. That is not possible. And that's irresponsible to say that you as a therapist. Now, again, maybe he's just exaggerating for effect and he knows it. Let's rewind that.
Slow process, and there was a lot of suffering. And you know me, my action would be, well, then go fuck yourself. Are you kidding me? If I'm dealing with someone with depression like that who's afraid they won't recover, I say, do what the fuck I tell you. Do exactly what I tell you. I guarantee you'll feel better. Guarantee 100% it's on me.
When I walked into your office...
Again, it's hard for me to know exactly what he's saying. He could be just saying that for an effect. Like, for example, I had a client that I knew... I don't know. I'll give him the benefit of the doubt and wait until we hear other kinds of things from him. But to be clear, there is no treatment for depression in general, when you consider all the variants and all the degrees and all the severity levels and all the causes, there is no treatment for depression that is 100, even close to 100% effective. And there's no individual therapist that's been demonstrated to be 100% successful with therapy at all times. That's really silly. Depression is rough, and for some people, they do it all. They do all the medication, trials. Maybe it takes 7-10 years to really go through all the different medications to see which one will work long term. They go through all the different kinds of trauma therapy. They do magnetic deep brain stimulation. They do diet. They do supplements. They do chiropractic. They do acupuncture. They do everything, and they're still very depressed. We call it treatment-resistant depression, and it's real, and it sucks, and it's rough.
Some form of action. You gave me a tool.
Yeah, it's imperative. I wanted speed in this, not speed to cure somebody in a week. That's impossible. But I wanted them to feel some change, some forward motion. It gives them hope. It's like, oh shit, that's actually possible.
So what are...
It's hard to know exactly what he means by that, but there is a whole field of therapy, brief therapies. He's talking very much like a brief therapist. We have Milton Erickson in there, again, solution focus, narrative people, other kinds of folks in that area. And I adhere to a lot of that, solution-focused therapy. Sometimes people will say motivational interviewing, but I'm not a huge fan of motivational interviewing based on the way that it's taught sometimes. Sometimes it can be used wonderfully, especially in the chemical dependency world. But solution-focused therapy is much more philosophically sound to me. Anyway, there's a lot of value to those kinds of therapies, and I use them all the time in certain situations, depending on the scenario. For example, brief therapies work with clients that don't have a lot of time, or they don't want to be in therapy really, and they're only there because someone's forcing them to be there, and you might only have 3 sessions with them. Or the client isn't looking to really explore things deeply. They don't want to go into the past. They want tools. They want something to do right now. So I might use that. Or I have a client who isn't ready to accept that they have a problem, and so I might use a backdoor technique that gets at the problem even though we're not talking directly about the problem. There's a lot of different nuance and artistry to this, and so there's a lot of soundness to what he's saying. Having said that, in the field of brief therapy, there are charlatans. There are quacks. There are people that will claim in 5 minutes I cured someone's schizophrenia, and that's just not possible. It's not demonstrated by the research. Even when they look into these individuals, they tell a really great story. They're often very charismatic, and they'll say, yeah, this, like, a long time ago I heard this story, and I remember being mildly convinced by this, but then I looked into it more, and it's ridiculous. I think it might have even been Milton Erickson, that he talked to someone that had ongoing schizophrenia and was suffering quite a bit, delusions. The charismatic therapist said, instead of working against the delusions and telling him that he had delusions and trying to medicate him all the time and locking him up, I decided to just go with the delusion. And when he was talking about how the aliens were going to get him, I said, yeah, I agree. Aliens are out to get me too. And when he said that he had to escape the institution because he had to save the president, I said, okay, let's figure out a way to break you out of here. Let's get the keys. And guess what? The next day, no delusions. Okay, is that possible? Sure. Did that cure the schizophrenia? No. It's like not possible. There are techniques in therapy with people who have delusions that have those kinds of elements to it, for sure. Because, of course, we don't want to be constantly working against people and telling them that they're wrong, especially if they're quite convinced of their delusions. There's not a lot of good to that, but you're not going to cure their issues. So I don't want to say anything disparaging about anybody. And so I hope we don't go there.
Opportunity.
Tools change your mood and then just give you a sense of hope that won't be your mood forever.
That's correct.
It's basically a real-time visualization exercise you do in your head at that moment.
Yeah, so in that sense, I'm a teacher. I'm teaching the person how to use it and also teach them when to do it.
Okay, so I think I know what he's talking about, which is something that I use as well and a lot of other therapists. It's a humanistic notion. At least that's what I think I'm hearing. It emerged out of humanistic philosophy. And humanistic therapy is a broad group of people that thought differently, but we kind of clump them together. And they were about being in the here and now. They emerged in the 50s and 60s. You think Carl Rogers, Maslow, Mustakas, there's a whole bunch of people. Viktor Frankl, there's a lot in there. And in the field of family therapy, you have Whitaker and Satir. He's into Virginia Satir. Listen to my whole deep dive on Virginia Satir. I also have a deep dive on Viktor Frankl. Within this field that emerged in the 50s, 60s, 70s, it's so influential, humanistic psychology and humanistic therapy, that you might believe this is just the way everyone thinks, but they were so influential that their ideas spread throughout our culture and within my field that when you learn about the history, you're thinking, well, of course they came up with that because everyone thinks that. Those things are obvious. But it wasn't present at the time because the dominant fields of psychology and psychotherapy were psychoanalysis and behaviorism, to some extent cognitivism, which did not include any of these things. Things like people are basically good on the inside, and if you allow them to express themselves, to express their feelings, then the barriers to their well-being will go away and they will be able to feel better. Someone who is anxious or depressed or feels like their life isn't going that well and might be losing sleep or having a hard time concentrating at work. And when you talk to them, you discover that they don't want this job. They don't want to be in this marriage. They have never done what they wanted to do. Well, most people would say, well, hey, you should be doing what you want to do. You're doing things that are counter to yourself. You're not moving towards self-actualization, right? You're de-actualizing yourself. And when the person pursues a career that they like, maybe they get a divorce and they find a partner that they want to be with, and they start living in their emotions, they're connected to themselves. This is likely to reduce suffering and to improve function. Their sleep will get better, their job performance will get better, their marital satisfaction will improve, their mood will improve. It's pretty obvious, right? Well, humanistic psychology essentially came up with this idea, because originally the idea was that if you have dysfunction, there's something wrong. You have a disease of the brain, and we have to treat that disease instead of thinking of the self as self-correcting, that the self has the potential to correct for itself. And there are barriers that get in the way of that. When you remove the barriers, the self is able to actualize itself and live and function and be happy, that kind of thing. I'm not describing it very well, but anyway, so a part of this is not necessarily going into the past, not necessarily even looking at people as having pathologies, but to live in the here and now. A lot of humanistic psychologists are about here and now, about what are you doing right now? Don't worry, people that, I'm always having problems with this. I'm always running into problems with that, and I keep thinking about what's going to happen in the future. And what they'll say, and it's also influenced by Eastern philosophy and maybe Yoda, of live in the here and now. Always thinking about the future. No, don't future trip. Thinking about the past, letting that define you. No, who are you now? What are you going through now? What do you want to do now? How do you want to think about it now? Normally you would think about it this way, but how do you want to think about it? What's useful to you? You're free. You don't think of yourself as shackled to the past, or don't think about the future. The future, anything could happen in the future. What are you doing now? What do you want now? And to emphasize that for people can be extremely helpful. You might even get micro with the body of just like, what's your body going through right now? What are you feeling in your body? Can you feel the seat below you? What's the temperature? What do your shoulders feel like? What's your neck feel like? What are you looking at right now? What are you smelling? All those things. What does your stomach feel like? What is your breathing like? Like attention to that. There's mindfulness and meditation. There's a lot of related fields to this that we're all a part of this, by the way. It's a very diverse area. But he sounds like he's coming from that place, and he's also framing it as tools. So I think that it's a little bit of an extra thing to what I'm saying. It sounds like he is trying to help people to, when you run into a situation where it might go down a road of negativity and of dysfunction, stop and think, okay, what can I do right now in my mind in terms of how I narrativize it, or how I approach it, or how I perceive it, how I interpret it, so that I go down a different road of function, I think is what he's saying. I don't know. All right, well, that does it for that episode. Everyone out there, please take care of yourself because you deserve it. You really, really do.